Well, the first thing I should say is huge congratulations to Sarah. The results that you described getting with kids in your classroom is demonstrating what's possible for our kids all across the country. And the tragedy is that it hasn't happened yet. The hope is that it is happening at small scale, so huge congratulations to you for what you've done. Seriously, seriously. This will get to one of my basic points about where we are in the trajectory of American education, so I'm going to come back to that. The second thing I'll say is no thank you, though, for that introduction, because after that introduction, I was just saying to Sarah I should sit down because that will be the highlight of the evening, because there's no way I'll match that expectation. But I'm really, really honored and excited to be here for so many reasons. My involvement in public service began actually in Little Rock back in 1991 and 1992. I was 25 years old and a couple years out of college, and had the opportunity to meet then Governor Clinton when I was in Washington, D.C. And didn't have a car, and had sort of a half job and maybe 3/4 of a job, and I called a friend who joined the campaign to ask if I could help this nascent campaign back in October of '91, and he said no, but there was no office in D.C. yet. But did I have a car? Could I pick the governor and Hillary Clinton up at the airport because they didn't have Secret Service protection or driver? So I said sure. So I borrowed my roommate's car, and I began the really high impact, high leverage, substantive role of volunteer driver, and would drive them around in the first couple months before the campaign got going. And one of my favorite stories, which I don't think I've ever, I know he's never heard, and maybe it'd be better not to repeat this to him, but one of the times I was driving as a 25-year-old through the streets of Washington, getting to some event, I got a little lost. And so we were going through the back streets, for those of you who know Washington, of Adams Morgan, and at one point he said, "It's so good to be with a local who just knows the back route, the back ways to get to where we're going." So I didn't correct him. Then I was here speaking of how great it is to be able to say the words President-elect Obama, which is, I'm sure not necessarily for everyone in the room, but I think for our country, an absolutely wonderful time of hope and opportunity, as challenging as this next 4 years is going to be. I remember being here election day, election night of 1992, and being unbelievably excited with others here and around the country to be able to talk about President-elect Clinton. And I feel like this is now another time of great hope and even of greater crisis. And so the stakes are high. So I'm excited to be in Little Rock and at a school. I'll get to substantive comments in a minute. Some people call me a social entrepreneur, of being an entrepreneur in the social nonprofit sector, having seen an issue like the school principalship, and we saw every great school in America that we saw had a great principal. So the basic insight of New Leaders was to create a nonprofit social enterprise to take that insight to scale, working with government, outside of government, but supportive of government to ensure great principles. And it's a social enterprise. And I feel like in some ways, Bill Clinton and your dean here, both at the Clinton Foundation and the School of Public Service, in my view, are social enterprises, because they were creating innovative foundations, schools of public service that didn't exist before, taking key insights and taking them to scale. And I think help illustrate the notion of public service in this country today. Includes government, for sure, but it also includes taking just brilliant insights and then creating new social institutions like the foundation, like the School of Public Service here, to actually act on that and create something where there was nothing before. And I think that kind of creation of new opportunity through social innovation that you got right here, I think is an important part of our future in many respects, certainly an important part of public service. So those are a couple opening thoughts. One thing I do sometimes when I talk to groups that I know has so much expertise and so many interesting questions and ideas, and I think I'll try tonight, is, bear with me for a minute, because I think this will work. I'd love, before I spend about 15, 20 minutes giving a little bit of a talk, to know kind of what are the most important questions on your mind. So what I'd love to do is for you to take a moment and reflect, and I'll go on there if you'd raise your hands, and I'd like if you could just very briefly introduce yourself and very briefly say one thing you'd like me to talk about, or one question on your mind that you'd like me to address as I talk. And then what I'll do is take about 3 or 4 minutes to organize my thoughts. And as the term Sarah and many of you educators use is, if you could do with your elbow partner, while I'm organizing my thoughts, I'll give you a question to talk about. And then I'll try to give you a little bit of talk based on what is of interest to you. And then we'll have more time for discussion afterwards. So with that, let me ask if you want to. Let me get my paper out, which Sarah just gave me, fortunately. I don't know if you all have this issue. I now take notes on my BlackBerry a lot of the time, and the problem is when I do that, I have people who now think that I'm emailing while I'm talking to them or getting talked. I realized it's better to use pen and paper. But yes, yeah.
My question is,
And so if you wouldn't mind telling me just your name,
who
name
I
too.
am. Okay. I'm Annie Abrams, and this is the first night I've been here that I've not worn a Barack pen. He is now the President of the United States, and I'm speaking now of my interest for Arkansas that's been on the bottom almost all of my entire life. It's 40, almost 50 if it wasn't for Mississippi, 48, 47, 46.
Yeah.
My concern tonight is how can we in Arkansas, which will be on the bottom boat of education, move up to be a leader, not only in America, but in our global educational system that we all must live under?
It's a great question. So let's keep going, and I'll give my thoughts about all these, and I won't answer that yet, but in my talk, and then afterward, I'm looking forward to a real discourse about these. Yes, sir.
My name's Larry Burton. I'm curious about your take on the promise or the perils of charter schools. Charter schools.
Great. I know that's a hot topic here, and I'm psyched to talk about it. Yes, go ahead.
I'm Lisa Black with the Public Ed Foundation, and I'm curious to know how, for instance, in Memphis, how you began to work with the community in Memphis to establish a New Leaders for New Schools center there, and how you reach out into the community.
Great, terrific. Sounds like you guys do great work here. I was reading a little bit about it. Yes.
My name is Lauren Thrift, and I work for the YMCA. I'm also a musician, and my question, two parts. Can you address the importance of educational after-school programs and also music education? Thank you.
Great, thanks. You say in tough economic times, one of the things I'm worried about is cuts in music education, so we'll get to that. Yes.
I'm Todd Moore. I'm a Clinton School student, and I'm concerned about the future of No Child Left Behind.
Great. We could spend the whole time on that. Great. Yes, sir.
Ken James, Commissioner of Education in the state. I'd like you to talk a little bit about the pipeline for leaders.
Pipeline for
in terms of retiring administrative ranks and building the pipeline for leadership in the future.
Great. I'd love to hear your perspective later on that and all these other questions too. Yes, ma'am.
Just following up on what Commissioner James said, I'm Vicki Savers, and I want to know how we could get a New Leaders for New Schools here in Little Rock.
All right, thank you. Yes.
Dennis Burrow. And something I've discovered is that the state here is not tracking truancy. I want to know if you know, is the rest of the country tracking truancy? Or how do we lose so many kids that disappear? And then the other part with that, do we need to change the whole system of education and do something different than what it is currently?
Great. Maybe last one or two. Yes.
My name is Deborah Birdsong, and I'm interested in your comments regarding private education versus public education. There is a difference, and how your new leaders bridge that, and to what degree is it effective?
Great. Thanks. That's great.
Andrew McSwain. As an aspiring social entrepreneur, I'm curious of some of the techniques and methodologies for taking a pilot project and scaling it up while still maintaining the integrity of the mission and outcomes and impacts that you want to have.
Tension between scale and quality is huge. Okay. Oh, yes, last question.
Thank you. My name is Don Ernst. I work at the Central Arkansas Library System. I have like 27 questions in one, but first, just your own thoughtful critique of the problems with the assessment structures, coupled to the that's my editorial, the increased centralization that we've seen from the states and the federal government over the last 2 decades, and the problem of the daily lives of kids, particularly in high schools, and the endurance of a lot of boredom, and we know a lot about that. But sort of your larger critique of schools as we currently keep them?
Those are all good questions. That last question just made my task even harder than if I had not taken that question, but I'm glad you came. So with that, I'm now going to take maybe 5 minutes instead of 3 or 4, given the complexity of those questions. But here's the question that I'd love to ask you all to be with your elbow partner. If there were, to pick one of two questions, whichever one sounds good to you. One is, if there's no silver bullet in anything, including education. No way. But if there were one thing that you think ought to answer the first question, would it be a leading part of improving education across Little Rock and the state? Knowing there isn't one thing, if you could pick one that would be a priority to focus on, what would it be and why? And that's one question. Or the second question, if you prefer, is if you've been involved in education, what one significant thing have you learned from your experience? Pick either of those questions with an elbow partner, take about 5 minutes, and then I'll be back up to respond to your questions. Okay, I'm going to give you a 1-minute warning to finish up your conversations. Just 1 minute. I hate to do this because this looks like such a fantastic set of conversations. And I do think this shows how much energy there is in this place and across the country, and how many ideas and insights there are to tackle this. So I'm sorry to have to cut that off, but I do think it shows what part of what's possible in the country when we channel our energies right. I just have to. I'm so curious. So I'm about to go into my comments, but would just one or two people want to raise your hand and just say if there was a particularly interesting insight that you heard someone next to you share? Are there one or two people who want to share any? And I can't do more than two because I don't have time.
If we are to succeed, education is a peace tool. And if we invest as much in education, human capital, as we do in military might, we would be better off. And I use the analogy that how much has it cost to produce the generals of the military out of our military academies versus how much it costs to produce a master teacher?
Yeah, we spend more on generals than principals and master teachers, that's for sure. One other comment, and then I'll dive into my thoughts.
For us, our group, we looked at the stakeholders in education. We looked at the parents, the school itself, and the general community. Then we asked ourselves, why are the parents not involved in the children's education? Why don't they go to meetings if a PTA meeting is called? Is it because the school is an impediment? Maybe there are some rules that stop, act as a barrier to stop parents from going there, or there's something general, causing this problem. Maybe there are underlying problems, maybe right from home in schools. So we're discussing around that social issue.
All right, well that's, and I know there are a tremendous amount of other insights, and again, my main point, I am one person who will share from the perspective and the experiences I've had in social enterprise and policy and looking at schools around the country, my thoughts, but my fundamental point, if there are 2 points that I left you with tonight, one is what I started with what Sarah was saying, is that at small scale, our kids from every background, of every race, of every ethnicity, every socioeconomic status, family income, linguistic background, we have evidence, it's not just aspiration, but evidence that in certain classrooms in schools, we have kids from all backgrounds who are in fact succeeding at high levels with tremendous hard work from not only students but adults, and good instruction and good expectations, high expectations, the right relationships and support. It is happening. And the fundamental, I think one of perhaps the greatest domestic challenge of our time is how to take the fact that it is happening at small scale, but that it's not at large scale. That Arkansas is at the bottom of the country, but across the country, we have 1 in 10 low-income kindergartners who wind up graduating from college. We have nearly 2/3 of our fourth graders of color who can't read at a basic level. We have 30% of all of our kids drop out of high school. Once we were number 1 in the world in college and high school graduation rates, we've slipped to the bottom half of the industrialized countries in high school graduation rates and to 15th in college graduation rates. Interestingly, not actually because we've gotten worse, but this country and all that data, we've actually stayed exactly the same. So we haven't gotten worse. We stayed exactly the same, while much of the rest of the world is leaping ahead of us. And so as the world races ahead in these new times, we have, in fact, with pockets of excellence, we've stagnated. So how we reconcile these realities of what's possible, and we've demonstrated, including classrooms like yours, Sarah, and others here, and clearly around Arkansas and Little Rock, there are pockets of excellence around the country. How to reconcile that with the tragedy we have done at scale is one fundamental sort of the challenge that we've got to solve. And our ingenuity, our leadership, our collaboration, our teamwork, our public service is needed to get to that. That's my first fundamental point. And the second point, if that's the problem is defined, then the second point, and actually this was one of, I like to quote this even when I'm not in Little Rock, one of Bill Clinton's favorite lines, or one of my favorite lines of his, was there hasn't any problem in America that can't be fixed by what's already happening somewhere in America. Every problem has got a solution somewhere in America, and we've got the ingenuity to do it. And I do think that this evening, just the energy that you heard around these tables show that if we channel our energy right, our educators' energy, our civic energy, our students' energy, our city year and other service corps members' energy, we can solve this, and that's going to be a key ingredient. And figuring out how to define that problem clearly and focus our energies on it, I think, is what's going to get us to this race, not to the bottom, but to the top for states like Arkansas to becoming the lead of this country and the world. And all my thoughts from that are just kind of footnotes with some of my specific thoughts about your questions. But that said, I've talked about where we are in education, and it's dire. I think that, and President-elect Obama has been clear about this. He's been clear, and I think rightly so, that education must be one of our top national priorities. And there are people, I will tell you, who have advised him not to make it a priority. We've got 2 wars, terrible economy, important health issues, energy issues. People do make the argument there isn't time to focus in a significant way on education. And he, like President-elect Clinton, who talked about education everywhere he went, and made some real progress in the 90s on education, but we have so much more progress to make. Obama is clear, no, we have to make this a priority. One, because you can't have an economic agenda with just short-term fixes. If we just fix the short-term problems, which we have to do, then we still have the long-term issues which keep getting us into this situation in the first place. And he always says, when asked about the economy, while we fix these short-term issues, we've got to make key investments in our long-term economic future. Always energy, healthcare, education, making dramatic progress in educational achievement and attainment. So we've got to focus on it, and fortunately we have a president-elect who is focused on it for economic reasons, for fairness reasons. We have an American dream today in our country depends on better education. We actually are, while we pride ourselves as a country on social mobility, we're at risk of becoming a society of the haves and have-nots based on the educational divide. And you all know this, but there's data that backs it up. The average wage of a college graduate is now more than triple the wages of a high school dropout, and more than double the wages of a high school graduate. You earn based on what you learn. And this fairness issue, hopefully from my perspective, ties to actually our economic interests as a society. Because in the early 20th century, we created an education system that was arguably, it didn't really, but arguably met the needs of our economic needs at the time. We produced a small number of young people who could learn at high levels to be the leaders of society, and most kids who could learn at low levels, and had enough skill to get a decent job and raise a family. My great-grandfather immigrated from Europe in 1902, and had a 3rd grade, moved to Milwaukee, where I grew up, in Wisconsin, and got a 3rd grade level of education, and that was enough for that era. And now one of our New Leaders programs in Milwaukee, I meet kids who are high school students who have that level of education that he had that was enough 100 years ago, but it's not now. Their future's shot without at least the ability to get some post-secondary education, whether a 2-year degree or 4-year degree or some post-high school training. And the economic needs of those times did not dictate the need to get high quality education for all kids. The hopeful news from my perspective, even as urgent as the problems are, is that our economic interests are actually tied with our fairness interests now. Because in this economy, 3/4 of the fastest growing occupations in this country require some post-secondary education now. There's an economist who recently come out with data, and I'm probably a little too heavy on the data, but I think this crowd's you're interested in education and a data-driven group, and so hopefully that's okay. But there's new estimates out that by 2012, that we may have 7 million jobs go unfilled or overseas because we don't have enough skilled workers with some post-secondary education in this country to take those jobs. So not only is this a fairness issue, we can't compete with other countries across the world unless we raise our overall game in education and close the achievement gaps for kids in poverty and kids of color, because we can't win without all of our kids if we're going to fill those 7 million jobs with a better education. So the hopeful news, I really think I was in Seattle last week when Bill and Melinda Gates announced their new strategy in education. It's very impressive what they're doing. I think you're seeing a lot of the business community rally in a way that they wouldn't have in previous decades, because the enlightened business leaders across the country, and I know in Arkansas, realize and recognize that their economic and our economic interests are now tied to our fairness and American dream interests. So given that, the first question is the question. So how does a state like Arkansas how does any state in the country, how does any community in this country race to the top? It's a big question. I will say I believe there are a few key drivers. There are so many ingredients, but the tough question in education is what are the few things that you can focus on that then make all the other good things possible? And this is not necessarily right for Arkansas, but it's my view. If I had to pick the few most important drivers in a state like Arkansas, or any state, my home state of Wisconsin or elsewhere, first of all, I think there has to be to get the dramatic changes we need, not just incremental changes, but the dramatic changes we need. First of all, there has to be public will with civic and political focus. We have to believe that education actually is front and center and is a top priority. And I've never seen a school system or state make dramatic improvements where there isn't significant political leadership, business leadership, bipartisan leadership, and civic involvement. So yeah, education is a priority. So even before you get to the specifics, I think agreeing in real ways that it is a priority is huge. And I think that Obama has done that as a presidential candidate, and will do that as a president, by the way. Some of this hasn't gotten reported by the media enough, but in all three debates, he made clear education will be a top priority. Education wasn't even in the questioner's question, but he made it clear it would be a top priority. The question about investments, he made clear that in these economic times, education will be one of the areas that needs to be protected in these tough fiscal times because of the long-term payoff. I guess I got to move out of campaign mode, but I got used to the comparison of USA Today reported that Obama gave 12 major education speeches in the last year and McCain 2. President-elect Obama was making education a part of every single speech he made across the country, and McCain didn't. But I'll tell you, I mean, I work in a very bipartisan way, and some of you may know, and Don knows, my brother, we have a bipartisan family. My brother was John McCain's communications director back in 2000 and is a wonderful guy, despite his politics. And look, McCain's a decent person and a great man of service to the country, and he cares about education. There just was a different view on to what extent education ought to be prioritized at the national level, where there's some legitimate discussion, even though I think it must be prioritized at the national level. But the bottom line is that we have a president-elect who has made education a focus, and so the number one thing for a state like Arkansas, I think, is real and consistent prioritization of education. And prioritization, I will say, not just of inputs in education, but of outcomes and results in education. I admire the president-elect for many things, but he begins many of his education talks by saying the current achievement gaps we have in this country are morally unacceptable and economically untenable. I think defining this as a crisis is important. It's easy to say sometimes our education's pretty good, but we just got to do a little bit better, but that doesn't spur the kind of intense drive or the change in outcomes for kids. So I think prioritizing much better educational outcomes is number one. Number two, I do believe that really rigorous standards for what kids ought to know and be able to do at each grade level with aligned, high-quality assessments, and as arcane as this is, but data systems that provide useful data, as the teachers in the room know how important it is. Data tests are not going to be useful because you clobber somebody at the end of the year because they didn't do well on them, or say, hooray if they did. The reason data is useful is to give really useful data in the hands of educators and students and parents, where this works well, to say how well are kids progressing to make progress toward what they need to learn, and then using the data where they're learning, where they're not, to modify teaching and learning during the day and during the week and during the month. And as the educators in the room are nodding, and people who haven't spent time in this think it sort of sounds boring, but it's the way that great baseball teams have become great baseball teams, as great companies become great companies, and the way great schools become great schools. But you can't do that with, to me, this whole second area without clear, rigorous standards for what kids ought to be able to know, be able to do. High quality, not dumbed down, but high quality aligned assessments and data systems. I think that's the second area. Third area, I think, is talent, and teaching and school leadership. Quality. And the research is very clear that the most significant factor in schools driving improved achievement for kids is the quality of teachers and quality of teaching. But it's not just one great teacher. The evidence is also clear. A kid, especially who's behind, needs like three great teachers in a row, which means you've got to have a whole systemic approach to attracting the best people into the profession, retaining them, giving them career ladders. I do think rewarding people for performance in fair ways and investing hugely, which is, I voted with my feet in 1999 when I went to start New Leaders, investing in great principals, because we don't see great teaching school-wide without great principals who actually can be the CEOs and instructional leaders of their school. So the principal pipeline is a huge issue. So I think the third big issue is a massive, intense focus on talent at the teacher and school leadership level and above. And the last one I would say in terms of a state like Arkansas, to me directionally, is, and this is the toughest to affect, but is shift in our mindsets and our adult expectations about what our kids are capable of achieving. I think there are too many people in this country who believe that actually kids, because they haven't been served well educationally to date, can't learn. And kids, and often it's stratified, and we see it across the country, and we have well-meaning teachers who've not seen it done better, who often believe a kid coming from poverty can't learn at higher levels, as opposed to how do we modify what we do to actually ensure that there are high expectations and the support to help kids succeed. So shifting that expectation about what our kids are capable of achieving, and all of our kids are capable of achieving, I think is the last. So to me, those are the four big things, and then sustaining that over time. You can't just have a one-shot deal. And so that's the big question, I'd say. But under the banner of that, let me just mention a few of the specific things that came up. NCLB, maybe the best way I can lean into this is the President-elect's education agenda basically divides into 4 points, because the national government, education is a national priority, but it's a state and local responsibility. So his agenda is designed to support and catalyze efforts in 4 ways. 1, early childhood education, quality early childhood education, which I was talking about K-12 schools in my answer before, but you can't succeed in K-12, I don't think, fully without investing in quality early childhood education. And the President-elect has called for an unprecedented $10 billion increase in early childhood education to make early childhood education affordable and available for all kids, especially kids from low-income families. Second focus of his 4 are transformed and improved public schools with an enormous focus on teaching quality. I mean, he says, look, more than anything else, we have to focus on how do we really support the quality of teaching across the country, especially for kids in low-income families. He's called for recruiting an army of people into the teaching profession with very generous service scholarships that would cover the full cost of college for anybody who agreed to teach in a high-need school for a high-need subject for 4 years. He wants to overhaul schools of education. I actually don't know about the schools of education in Arkansas, but mostly around the country. They are outdated, and they are not preparing teachers and leaders for the job of today. And they must, because we have to both recruit well, but give people the knowledge. There's real knowledge today, as you know, about what it takes to teach or lead well, and to really provide that knowledge in useful ways to help teachers and principals who are coming into the profession that actually will attract and engage our most talented young people is so crucial. And he's got a whole agenda for supporting how school systems to overhaul with grants, to overhaul the way they recruit, select, evaluate, pay teachers with big grants from the federal government, matched locally. So the second area is quality public schools. Teaching is the focus. Third is college affordability. He has said that we've got to make college affordable for every student in America, and has said that in exchange for students' willingness to perform community or national service, like City Year, for example, that he would make college affordable for 4 years, expanding Pell Grants and providing a $4,000 a year opportunity tax credit for young people that would make the first $4,000 of tuition and fees free. And fourth in his agenda is civic involvement, especially parental involvement. And early on in the campaign, when any speechwriter forgot to put this part of the speech in, he always would add it back in because he believes it so strongly that government cannot do this alone. And so he wants to use the bully pulpit and other policy levers to call on parents to put away the TV and the video game, to get kids to read with kids, to get kids to come to school on time and do homework. And he thinks finding ways to engage and support that parental involvement is so crucial. So that's his agenda. Within that, just let me rattle off a few quick answers to some other questions then. NCLB. On NCLB, you know, I agree. I helped write his policies on this, so I agree with what he says. So I'll give you my take, and it's his take. I mean, not because those were my ideas, but I think a lot of us gave him information and realized, I think, what kind of approach he would want to take. But the goals of NCLB are right. High standards, greater accountability, focusing with more transparency on the achievement gaps are absolutely right, and we need to advance from that, not retreat. And we've got big problems in NCLB. I mean, let's face it. There has not been a focus on how, once you set standards, on how to help kids and teachers reach those. The assessments are basically a problem in many areas. We don't have, I mean, we have too much test prep going on in this country. And in good schools, you have good assessments that are used as kind of a guiding star, but then they don't become the focus. There's actually research out of Chicago recently that shows test prep over the course of 2 or 3 years actually leads to worse test results over time. So how you make sure you have and use good assessments, but not just through test prep, is crucial, and more resources. And he's been clear, if we are going to expect much more from our students and teachers, we've got to invest more. So I think there's some good things, and he was almost unique in the campaign to both embrace the goals of NCLB and be quite critical about these areas of focus on better teaching, better assessments, and more resources. Charter schools, again, he's right on this. He said, quality is what matters. How do we strengthen public education? And that means, some of the best schools in the country, I've been to some of these, some of the best urban schools in the country are charter schools. And some of the worst schools in the country are charter schools. The question is, how do you use the lever of charters in order to strengthen a community's capacity to provide public education for kids? And I think there is incredible work being done. Some of a disproportionate share of the examples of schools that are getting all kids to learn high levels are charter schools. And yet we have so many failures as well. So the question is, how do you support what's working and not be afraid of it just because it's a different governance form, but also have a strict focus on quality accountability? I mean, this is different than a voucher idea where you kind of have the market at work. This is a focus on how do you have quality lead to different kinds of options, quality options for kids. On leadership, pipeline of leadership I've talked about. Music education, I just think, is after-school programs. We have to ensure that both kids are getting prepared in core academics as well as in the breadth of human experience, including music and the arts. I'll tell you, it's challenging. What's challenging for us, and this is where I think after school and extended time comes in, especially for kids who are the furthest behind academically, it is challenging when you have to, I mean, it's possible, and I've seen schools do it, where you integrate academics and music and the arts in ways that actually expose kids, but also help kids make progress academically, but it's hard, especially when kids are far behind. They got to catch up in the limited time. So I actually think after-school programs and extended time is part of the answer by giving more time, so you don't have to make some of the false choices between some core academic skills and music and the arts. But I also think they can be integrated. On truancy data, I think one of the fixes to NCLB has got to be not just tracking test scores, but saying, okay, some people just want to track reading and math test scores. And there may be people in the room who believe that. Some people want to track 100 things, not just outcomes, but 100 kinds of inputs, which I think would water down accountability. My belief is the way to go is to have a small set of important student outcomes, not just one test score, and focus a school on that small set of student outcomes. I think you could have college enrollment rates. I think you could have attendance and truancy. So I think that this is going to be part of how we think about rethinking No Child Left Behind without jettisoning it, but kind of moving to the next level. On the social entrepreneurship and new leaders, I do think that one key, I would say, and I didn't mention this in one of my top 4, but I think the top 4 things that I mentioned to respond to your question about how Arkansas could race to the top, is an active nonprofit and social sector working closely and outside but with the school system. I think there are times the school system needs to take the lead on things, and there are times when it's hard for the school system to innovate. And when I started New Leaders for New Schools, it was based partly on the insight that great schools have great principals, and there was no nationwide effort to try to recruit and train very talented people to become principals. And I also realized that as I knew superintendents and deans of schools of education, it seemed like it'd be hard to innovate, to create something totally outside the box in a sustained way within a school system. But I also didn't want this to be apart from the school system. So what I was thrilled was there was this notion of social enterprises and nonprofits. There could be nonprofits working in very close partnership with school systems and universities, but just outside. In our case, to create a new outside-the-box solution for how you recruit and train people to become principals. And so we now partner with 9, soon to be 10 school systems across the country, but we only work in places where we have a deep partnership with the school system, the civic leadership of the community, where we're preparing principals at scale for that community. So in places like Memphis or New Orleans or Baltimore or Oakland, we're over the next several years going to provide enough leaders to lead half of the schools in the city, as our current principals are retiring, to bring in a new wave of principals in, but it's in partnership with the school system, and yet we found it gives the stability, in our case, where we had change in superintendents, and the average superintendency in the country is about turnover every 3 years or so. We've actually found that having new leaders is just outside the system has given more stability with support from the superintendent and the business community, is given more stability, but the risk is if you go too far outside the system. So New Leaders as a social enterprise is an example. Teach for America is an incredible example. The KIPP schools are, College Summit, citizen schools, and then in every community across the country, including I know in Little Rock, there are local examples, and I think that's an important part of the landscape. And so your question about how to balance the scale versus quality, I think is the biggest question for us in the nonprofit sector. And ultimately, my belief is that quality trumps. And you only can grow as much as you can drive quality, because ultimately the quality of outcomes for kids matters more than the scale you reach. But we have found that sometimes, and Wendy Kopp, who runs Teach for America, I think, and we and I compare notes on this a lot, she believes this, I believe this. If you plan for it well, and you really think about not just the program, but your organizational plan and capacity, and you build a strong leadership team, you set big goals for scale, and if you do it in the right way over time, scale can actually drive quality. That as you sort of push yourself to think about how you scale something, it actually forces you to think, as long as you've got the right organizational capacity and the right team. So quality trumps, but we've found that if you, once you get the model built, which you have to do first in the first several years, I think over time thinking about scale can help drive quality. So with that, I think our New Leaders in Memphis and Little Rock, I'll close on. So we have a city competition process where we ask cities around the country to apply to become a New Leaders site. This has worked well for us. It's kind of a mutual selection process and a partnership formation process. So we take bids from cities around the country. The Memphis example, we had a civic coalition led by the Hyde Family Foundations and FedEx in Memphis and the Public Education Fund in Memphis, PIPE. And they basically sort of spearheaded this application. We then had a new superintendent come in as they were getting going, Carol Johnson, who is a terrific superintendent. And they basically bid and said, look, this is education's top priority, leadership's top priority, we want to work in partnership. They went through a 9-month process. Harold Ford Jr. actually was the first member of Congress to present to our board. But Lamar Alexander and Bill Frist supported it. It was very bipartisan, and we only go into places where it's embraced across the political and education and civic spectrum. And we go into one new city a year, and we do have a city competition process that does that, and I'd be happy to share the name of somebody on our team who deals with that. Our board just decided that we're going to sort of take a pause for this year, that we're not going to have a city competition this year, because we've expanded pretty quickly, going to this question of scale versus quality. We're about to announce Charlotte, North Carolina as our 10th city, and then in a year we'll launch another city competition. I hope I've answered all these questions. If there's time for 5 more minutes before we close, I'm happy to take more questions, but thank you very much.
If you could raise your hand, we'll get you a mic.
Thanks so much. I really don't have a question, just a couple of comments in terms of what you've outlined. Annie, 50th in per capita baccalaureate degrees. That's the only place we're 50th as a state. 18.2% of our population holds a baccalaureate degree. So as you can add that stat up in terms of data, you know we're not in the competitive pool in terms of what the other leading countries are doing at 55%. The pieces that you mentioned in terms of political will and what's happened in this state since 2003 has been phenomenal, and the data is there to support it. We've had the greatest infusion of K-12 dollars into education since 2003 in this state, driven by the legislature as well as the governor at that time and continued by this current governor. Current governor says in every speech that he gives across the state that there are 2 things that cannot be separated. That's economic development and education. We had a huge summit in Little Rock a couple of weeks ago where every county was required to come. And the governor's charge was to, what's going to be your skin in the game? Everybody wants jobs, everybody needs jobs, but clearly understanding that with 18.2% of our population with baccalaureate degrees, it could be very difficult to attract industry into the state to have high-paying jobs. Our high school curriculum now, one of the first 2 states with Achieve that had the rigorous course of study, 4 years of math, 4 years of English, 3 years science, 3 years social science. We, in AP, tied with New Hampshire, the highest increase in scores of 3 or higher in 07, highest increase in the College Board in terms of participation in AP. All that's been driven by legislation and political will in this state. And in 08, we had the highest test scores in the history of the state. And so we started years ago with kids at proficient and advanced on our benchmarks at 12 and 13%. We're now at 60 and 70%. And it's a rigorous test, and the research shows that it's aligned with NAEP. SRAB's had that data for years. So I had to correct some of the data points. I mean, we've got some key issues, there's no doubt. We still have a lot of areas that we need to grow on. But the bottom line with respect to standards and accountability, the most telling piece for us as a state was in '07 in the Washington Post, when the Secretary of Education stated that there's 2 states to model for standards, accountability, and leadership. That was Massachusetts and Arkansas. Now, Massachusetts has been there for a good number of years. That was the first time Arkansas has been in that conversation, so that's something we're very proud of. But we continue to work toward increasing our expectations. We've got a set of accountability standards right now that are extremely rigorous and high stakes. End-of-course examinations that are going to deny diplomas and things of that nature down the road that was a part of the business-driven reform efforts. So we've had all of those partnerships, and that's the result of Arkansas being where she is today in terms of those kinds of things. We have severe needs in terms of quality, capacity, and as a key point I think that you mentioned in terms of, and I don't think it is alone in Arkansas, and it's probably not just in the South, but I think we have a lot to do in terms of the value of education and how we value it and what we think it brings to the table. Everybody comes at this from their own reference point. We have a great job of escalating what that reference point is in the state in terms of what the expectations are and what kids are going to need to be competitive members of global society. That's one of the biggest issues I think that we face in Arkansas as we continue to move forward. So
well,
just a few comments.
No, I congratulate you on that. And what I would say is I would take the improvement that you're seeing here with the low level that you're at, that we're all at in the country, not just Arkansas, and say, okay, now you've earned the right to actually make even more dramatic improvement. And I often talk to new leaders for new schools. We're transparent too. Like RAND shows that our kids in our schools are learning at a faster rate than kids at their peers in their school systems. But it's not at a rate that's going to help them succeed. Basically, we're outperforming, and we could market that, but the fact is our kids are learning 2 months more a year than their peers, but our kids are coming in 7th grade 4 years behind, and it's not enough to catch up. So how do you take that improvement and that foundation you've laid here and use that to create some rally, it sounds like you're doing, but even keep rallying the urgency from everyone in this room around the state to make even more dramatic progress so that you can keep racing to the top.
Hello. Chad Williamson, Clinton School student, and I think somebody had this question over here about the private and public education dichotomy.
I missed that one.
And I think that's a big worry here in Little Rock because we read a case study a couple weeks ago that said 50% of the white students in this city go to private school.
Yeah.
So I think that has to be addressed at some point. And then really, how do they work together? Not necessarily how do they work apart because we already know they're working apart. How do they work together to increase or improve education?
Well, my quick comment on that, I'm sorry I missed that one because that's such an important question, is we have a very diverse set of institutions in this country providing education, and that's great. That's important. And private schools are a very important part of the landscape of American education. If we're going to succeed as a democracy and economy, we have to have outstanding public schools that are available for free to every child, so that we don't have any kid who doesn't have the ability to go to a very high quality and free school, while we're strengthening all of our schools. So I would just say having a powerful focus on how to ensure strong public education across the community, including charter schools done well, I think is crucial. And then, as long as you do that, I think the collaboration across institutional lines is fantastic. And I'll tell you, at New Leaders for New Schools, we have 80% now, 83% of our new leaders are in school systems, and about 17% are in charter schools. And so most cities, the vast majority are in district schools, and then some are in charters. And we think it's fantastic. They go through this intense, and we had 9,000 applications. We selected 550 out of those 9,000 people. Very selective, intense training. They go through intense experiences together. And then they begin in each city to actually build bridges and compare notes across charter and district lines. To me, that's one of the great hopes of the charter school effort, to actually inform what's going on. So I think that finding ways to ensure lessons being learned and shared across all those sectors is important, but I think you can't lose focus on how to ensure great public schools for the whole community.
Thank you very much for being here. I've got a question that relates to the 30% dropout rate.
Yeah.
Does the new president have a plan to address the needs of that 30% that drops out of high school? And if so, what is that plan?
Yeah. I would say the honest answer is he's got some very important strategies to support states and communities to do that. I would say he doesn't have a plan that will solve that on its own. I think it's important. I think he recognizes that education is a national priority, as I said, but a state and local responsibility. So the question is, how do you catalyze and support efforts in states and communities across the country to tackle that problem? So it's not like a Washington's going to fix it kind of plan at all, because that's not going to happen. It's going to be people around this. Your question before too, Don. I mean, this has got to be a local effort across the country where people are working together to improve schools. But that said, I mean, early childhood I think will pay off over the long term. But in terms of our public schools, he does. And his most important component of that, I don't have time to go into more detail now, is how at the high school level do we transform the teaching profession and ensure really quality teaching at the high school level for all of our kids, and including in literacy and numeracy for kids who've gotten several grades behind, 9th graders who are reading at 4th or 5th grade levels. How do we catch kids up? As well as enrichment and very rigorous academic subjects. So he's both, I'd say the two most important components are he wants to work with the nation's governors on ensuring really clear standards and high quality assessments to ensure the target's right, and then invest really hugely. He's got an $8 billion package to invest in teaching and school leadership quality with a big focus at the high school level. That'll feel unsatisfying because there's so much more than that, but those are some key components.
Time for one last question.
Mine is not a question as such, but I think one of the things about the president that we are going to have is we have to understand the principles from which he operates. As a community organizer, that means that it is, when you ask about public will, the we, in his speech in Grant Park, the word we was used 47 times. That was a commitment that I will not do it. Leaning on him as the I. We, and that's what every community is going to have to understand, that that's what he believes in. We can. And that has to be the will of this community. It has to be the will of this state. And that's our greatest challenge now. We, a collective, strong, we will overtake our discrepancies that we have. That's what I think is so important to understand. His very value system is a we.
I couldn't give a better close, so thank you and thanks everyone for tonight.